From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Doane, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion on the growing demands and value of water.
Welcome. My name is Jay Noose, and I am the new chairperson of the Friends Committee of the Danforth Plant Science Center. I'd like to welcome each of you here today to the center, especially our esteemed leaders, Bill Danforth, who threw us a curve by sitting back in the audience. Bill's back there, if you'd wave, Bill. And Jim Carrington, who's sitting here in front, president of our center. And a very warm welcome to each of you, particularly our center friends, and especially their guests who may be visiting the center today for the very first time. I would now like to thank the retiring chair of our Friends Committee, Matt Wolf, who has so ably guided us for the last 2 years. We appreciate Matt's service and everything that he has done for the center. Matt is away on spring break this week and sends his warmest regards. So a little applause for Matt's service. I've been asked by the center staff to perform a very awkward task of introducing myself. I don't know how to do that, so I'll just very quickly by way of background, I've been an active supporter of the center for the last 10 years and a member of the Friends Committee since 2004. My wife Lisa and I co-hosted the center's annual gala called Plantasia in 2008 and again in 2009. By day, I'm a corporate lawyer with the law firm of Bryan Cave, and am very actively involved in the local life sciences venture capital community. As it relates to the center's work, my father, Jim Noose, has a working farm which has been in our family for over 160 years. And I grew up on a little farmlet out in West County, St. Louis, so I can say I have somewhat legitimacy to say that I have plants in my blood. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, like many of you, I am a huge Bill Danforth groupie. I revere him as a hero. I would like to say thanks to our Friends Committee for hosting this Conversations program, and to Dr. Molly Klein, who's sitting over here, the chair of our Conversations Committee, for picking today's timely topic, developing it, and identifying our panelists. Having seen this past year the corn yield on my family's farm drop from 200 bushels, a yield of 200 bushels per acre, to 106 bushels per acre due to the drought, I, like many of you, are extremely interested to hear what our water experts are going to say today. We are very grateful to the Boeing Company, the sponsor of the Conversation series, for the past 7 years. Tonight's conversation program would not be possible without Boeing's generous support. As a part of our partnership with HEC-TV, we are pleased to note that this evening's program is being recorded and will be aired on HEC-TV multiple times on Sunday evenings at 5 p.m. beginning April 7th. You can also access this and past conversation programs on the Danforth Center website. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our veteran moderator, Professor Jim Davis of Washington University, and our distinguished panelists, Dr. Roberto Lenton, who is the founding executive director of the Robert B. Daugherty Water for Food Institute at the University of Nebraska, and is also the professor of biological systems engineering at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And also, Mr. Michael Doane, the Vice President of Sustainable Agricultural Policy for Monsanto Company, another great supporter of the center. Thank you. Jim, it's yours.
Well, I want to join in welcoming everybody. I'm just delighted to see such a large crowd to learn at least a bit more about a very important problem, water, and its the growing demands on it, its growing value. But I want to start by asking Dr. Lenton to tell us just a little bit about the Water for Food Institute. I'm assuming that many of us, maybe most of us in this audience, at least think we're familiar with Monsanto. We certainly have heard of Monsanto. Monsanto is sort of just across the street. But my guess is that fewer of you have heard of the Water for Food Institute at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So, Dr. Lenton, could you tell us a little bit about your institute, its mission, what it's trying to do, and indeed, why was it created?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks very much, Jim, and thanks to you all for inviting me to be a part of this conversation tonight. And the Institute has a very interesting background because it came about as a result of the vision of Robert B. Daugherty, after which we were named. And Bob Daugherty was the founder of Valmont Industries, the premier center pivot irrigation company in the world. And he essentially led that company from beginning to where it is now, and literally changed the face of Nebraska and many parts of the world because of this center pivot irrigation technology. Having made his fortune as a result of this combination of water and food, had a vision of an institute that would really address these global issues of water and food in a very concentrated way. He was concerned about how was the world going to meet increasing food requirements for a growing population and improving diets in the face of a diminishing water supplies, more pollution, concerns about climate extremes and so on, increasing droughts and floods. So how was the world going to reach that? And so he talked to the University of Nebraska and the university, and he decided to create an institute that through research, through training, through policy advice, could help the world to tackle these problems. And the result was a $50 million grant to the university in 2010. And the development of this institute that works across the 4 campuses of the university. It works across all the colleges and departments that have a bearing on these questions of water and food. So we work through the affiliated faculty. We have over 200 faculty in the 4 campuses of the university that are dealing centrally with these issues of water and food, and we're here to make it work.
And I think I probably should ask you, Michael, Monsanto is clearly not a water company, but you're here on the platform. How does Monsanto enter into the water food business? You're trying to create plants that are drought resistant?
Well, sure, and I just want to also say thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here and to be with such an esteemed colleague. You know, I kind of feel like, we've got this tortoise and hare effect, which is, he's the hare and I'm the tortoise, and the only way I'm going to keep up with him is if he lays down and takes a nap here on the stage, because...
I'm sitting here trying to think what my role is.
Yes. But, we're in the business of serving farmers all around the world, and we sell products to large farmers and small farmers all around the world. And without a doubt, one of the central issues that they have concerns about is how they're going to use scarce water resources to produce more food. And so it is, if not the issue, it's one of the top issues that we really focus on. We've had a long-standing commitment around research and development. I see people in the audience have really catalyzed that work. So I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of visionary folks at Monsanto that started this work a long time ago, and now we're seeing as the issue really becomes front and center that we have a contribution that we hope we can make, which is to help farmers do a better job at getting more crop per drop. So.
Well, now, I've been reading some about water, as you might imagine, and I keep seeing the phrase, more food with less water. But I think about population growth, I think about climate change, I think about urbanization, industrialization, increasing competition for water. Is more food with less water simply a hope, or is that in fact going to be something we see in the next decade or two?
Well, I don't know who would like to take that. I'm sure I'd like to enter in if this is fair play. So our history is that that's exactly what farmers have done. Field to Market, which is an organization we're proud to be a member of, has actually documented the long-term trends around how much water it takes to grow a bushel of corn or a bale of cotton. And what we found is since 1980, farmers have, through all kinds of different ways, improved the amount of water that it takes to produce.
That's true in the United States,
That's true in the U.S., absolutely.
What about Africa? What about Asia, India? Are they using less water per unit of food?
Yeah, I think the progress has been less. So I think that's exactly where some of the issues lie.
I think that they're very contrasting experiences. If you take China, China's been able to increase its agricultural production over the last couple of decades, essentially without increasing its irrigated area. And it's done that primarily by better agronomic practices and investment in existing irrigation areas. If you take India, it's achieved its increases in agricultural production primarily because it's been drawing more and more water. And I think people in India are very, very concerned about what they're going to do in the future. Because what they've done in the last 20 years is not at all sustainable over the long haul. So that's an area of concern. So you do have some good success stories. I think China is one. Certainly the United States, it's very interesting what you said about 1980s. If you look at the statistics of water withdrawals between 1950 and 1980, it was increasing every year. But it's leveled off since the 1980s. So that's, I think, the result of better practices.
But there's still competition for water. Just the other day, I was reading about litigation between Georgia and Florida and Alabama over who has rights to how much river water. I've read about competition in Nevada. Certainly competition exists in various regions in the United States. And by mentioning China and India, you come to another observation, and that is water is a global problem, but it's also a local or regional problem, and the solution in this region may not work there. Is there a global solution, or do we simply have to go country by country, region by region, town by town?
If I can start, take a crack at that one, there are common challenges that countries face and common approaches, but in the end, the solutions have to be very, very local. In the end, it's sort of watershed by watershed that these issues have to be tackled, and so a lot needs to be done by local authorities, river basin agencies, and so on. I do think on this question of competition, you have competition among, as you said, countries, certainly competition among states, conflicts, but you also have competition among uses of water, sectors. And that's where the issue for agriculture, I think, comes up, and the imperative for agriculture to do more with less, because realistically, in most countries, the demands for water, for industrial use, for municipal use, growing mega cities around the world, that's going to be a major draw on water, and agriculture is going to have to be more efficient in the way it uses water.
Can you develop that a little further? More efficient in the way it uses water. That suggests that we're doing some things now we should stop doing and start doing things we haven't yet started, or at least haven't started on a large scale, if we're going to use water more efficiently. How can farmers use water more efficiently? Changing the seeds, or changing the irrigation practice, or watching the calendar? How do you use water efficiently?
Yeah. So, I think that's that could be such a long discussion right there. But I think the one thing that we've done recently is just trying to enter into this issue, trying to discover the solutions with farmers. We, in 2009, started a water utilization learning center in the Western High Plains in Gothenburg, Nebraska. And this is at the confluence of the Platte River system and the Ogallala. It's one of the areas of the world where I think the concerns are the greatest around the solutions. And what farmers were facing out there, and what they were telling us, is that they were facing new constraints on how much water they could use. And they didn't want us to bring them a seed or bring them one piece of the solution. They wanted an integrated system. They wanted a way of thinking about these solutions in their overall management system. And I think that's been a real learning for us. And so what we've done is we've really invited in a whole range of technology providers. The university, and in fact the Water for Food Institute is collaborating there. And we have a whole range of folks that have now entered into this discussion around how do you get this more crop per drop. So that's kind of been how we've started in, is really very humbly inviting customers to discover these things with us, because there are no easy answers on any of this.
I think of the Western diet, which is pretty high in calorie and pretty high in meat. Is the Western diet sustainable as economies develop and as urbanization spreads? Could we get more food for the whole population if the Western diet became, I don't know, the Indian diet or the Chinese diet or the Mediterranean diet? But when I see 3,000 calories and 20% of that from meat, I see a high water usage. Fewer calories and much less meat, less water usage. So is the only way to expand the water supply is to be more efficient in its use, or should we use food and feed and fuel more efficiently?
Sounds like a good question for you.
It's I'm tempted to say all of the above. You know, these problems are so complex that you're going to have to. It's a multifaceted problem that needs multifaceted solutions. But I do think it's a fact of life that, and I don't think there are ways to really avoid this, that as incomes rise in the developing world, people are going to move. They're going to improve their diets. It's not necessarily going to become a full-blown Western diet, but it's a fact of life that people are going to invest the additional income that they have in better food for themselves and for their families. So they're going to move to a higher caloric intake. They're going to move to a more meat-based diet. So we have to, as scientists and as policymakers, we have to figure out ways to address what is inevitably going to happen in the developing world. So clearly there is room for addressing this issue of water and food by encouraging people to have more healthy diets, because I think, in fact, a healthier diet is going to translate into a diet that requires less food, less water intake. But I don't think it's a panacea. Just saying that the world has to become vegetarian in order to conserve water, I just don't think is a realistic approach to addressing that.
I agree with that, but moving to a Western diet may be more, but it won't necessarily be better. When I look at heart trouble, high blood pressure, obesity, and so on, the Western diet is not necessarily a healthier diet, it's just a bigger diet.
Exactly, and that's, and I think from a health point of view, developing countries, as their diets change, will have to be addressing these issues.
In many developing countries, there's also a food waste problem in storage and transportation with inadequate silos, for example, so that there's more spoilage and more attacks from vermin or varmints or whatever. So there are ways, it seems to me, to get more food without using more or requiring less water. You simply get more food, but the underlying water problem is still there.
Yeah, I might make an observation there that, you know, when this issue of food waste, the food that is lost between farm and fork, is a real problem, and it happens in both the rich countries and it happens in the poor countries in different ways, but you have that phenomenon in both contexts. The important thing to note is that food waste in the end is water waste, because the water that goes into food that is not consumed is water that is wasted. But again, it's not a panacea. I don't think we're going to be solving the world's water and food problems by reducing waste. It has to be one ingredient in a multifaceted approach to a solution.
If you had to name two or three of the most valuable innovations we could use to stretch our water supply or to reduce the demand for water, what would those innovations be? Would they be economic? Would we charge more for water, for example? Would they be political, changing the regulatory environment? What do you see as most essential to rationalize the use of water?
Well, I'm sure Michael has his list, but let me mention two or three, and you've alluded to them. Certainly, policies that provide the incentives to adopt more water-efficient technologies, I think, has to be a part of that solution. And in the end, that boils down to better pricing policies and removal of subsidies. So clearly, where there is a strong incentive for adoption of better water-saving technologies, you find that happening. But then you've got to come to the technologies themselves. And so suggestion number 2 is drip irrigation or center pivot irrigation that is much, much more efficient in terms of avoiding water losses than flood irrigation. And the third is on the agricultural technology front, because the more we can figure out crops that use less water for producing the same amount of biomass, we have a big part of the solution there. So you've got to work on the policy front, you've got to work on the irrigation technology front, and you've got to work on the agricultural technology front.
Mike, you want to enter?
Sure. I mean, this is really, I think, where we've focused a lot of our effort historically, and will continue to do so. You know, I'd start with just management practices that help manage soil. And you might say, well, what's the relationship between soil and water? And I would submit to you, you cannot manage water unless you manage soils. Soils are effectively like a sponge. They act as an environmental buffer, and they're what basically nature gave us as a way to really create water storage. Just to put a point on this, just did some calculations on this fact, and so if we could conserve 1 inch of soil water in soil across the whole of the U.S. cropland area, it would be 8 trillion gallons of water. Okay, so if we rather than have that evaporate or run off into the riverways, 8 trillion gallons of water. We can grow a lot of food with 8 trillion gallons of water. So managing soils so that they're healthy and living and really sequestering water, I think, is step number 1. And there's a lot of things that we can do to improve soil management. Number 2 is breeding. And, this is an area where building genetic gain historically has been a real source of improvement. We've done some hybrid studies out in Gothenburg, again, out in this western high plains. And what we found is the best hybrids from the 50s and 60s were yielding about 5 bushels of corn for every inch of water supplied. The best hybrids today are yielding 10 to 12 bushels of corn for each inch of water. And that's just through breeding. That's just raw genetic gain. And it's very slow, it's not very sexy, but it's the kind of thing we want to accelerate. We can have advanced breeding practices that really help us continue that genetic gain. And then the third thing is really, I think, biotech. And this is like the third leg of the stool that we've really been investing in, is using biotechnology to come in and where we've got difficult stress issues or difficult pest issues, using that to limit the damage that a plant sustains. A healthier plant will be so much better at withstanding a dry spell or a drought. And we've seen that with some of the first waves of biotech traits, and I think that can continue.
Let me ask you a question about plants that may be pretty narrow, but it's an interest to me. Do you work on a plant by improving the water uptake by the roots, or do you focus on photosynthesis and water escaping through the leaves of the plant? Or do you do both in order to make the plant more efficient in its use of water?
Well, so I'm going to, very humbly state that I'm an economist, so I'm not qualified to answer this question. I've been told by people that know, though, that it's kind of like Obama's energy policy. It's everything and above. So you have to work on all of these things, and this is very complex. This is why one gene or one pathway won't work. You have to be comprehensive. That said, I think where we've actually seen some of the best results is getting root systems that are healthier. And we've seen some real breakthroughs in being able to have plants that have root systems that can protect themselves. And we can think about this in terms of our lawns. If we have shallow-rooted lawns, about the 1st of August when the wind blows and the dry weather sets in, our lawns just bake. And if we got deeply rooted lawns, they'll withstand that stress. Out in Gothenburg, again, we've done these root digs, and we can see that some of the best genetics, the new genetics where these plants are protected from insect feeding at critical stages of growth, instead of rooting down, say, 20 or 25 inches into the soil, we've seen plants that are now rooting down 85 inches into the soil profile. This is phenomenal, and this is the kind of thing that really causes us to be optimistic that we can see some of these innovations continue to come through.
I know Monsanto is famous for its Roundup-ready seeds. It sounds like you'll be working soon on drought-ready seeds.
Well, certainly we've been focusing on this, and this is difficult science. Okay, so this is multi-gene effects. This is really challenging stuff to pull off. But we are launching our first product into the market just this year. So it's actually going into the field in a matter of weeks out in the Western Corn Belt. It's called Drought Guard. It's the first generation of a biotech trait that is specifically designed to help the plant manage the impact of drought in different ways. And this technology is always meant to be layered on top of all those good management practices of sequestering the soil moisture first, and then having the best genetics, and now having the first generation of biotech traits, and then with this trait added on, we think it gives that plant an even better shot at withstanding a dry spell or a drought.
Now, you mentioned sequestering the water in the soil and reducing the runoff into the rivers. But then I think of last summer where we worried about the low flow in the Mississippi, and barges were challenged to get through, and in some cases couldn't. So, but that strikes me as a competition for water. Do we want the water in the river to help barge, or maybe to help recreation, or maybe even help hydroelectric, or do we want water not in the river but on the land where the crops are growing? And you're an economist, you can deal with that question.
Well, see, I thought here you were going back over to Dr. Lenton. I was certain that was a policy question, so.
But it just shows why these issues of water and foods are so complex, because when you talk about water being wasted, you really have to ask the question, well, where is the water really being wasted, or is it simply being recirculated? And so when water is lost in an irrigation system, some of it, in fact, goes into the groundwater. Some of it finds its way back into the river, and it is used by crops or other uses further downstream. The Nile River, people recognize that one drop of water getting from the source of the Nile to the Mediterranean is probably used 20 or more times by different irrigation systems down the Nile. So one really has to be very, very careful about assuming that water that is lost in the process is lost entirely. Some of it is, of course, what is evapotranspiration is definitely used in the biomass process and goes and is evaporated, but some of it remains in the system.
But even what's evaporated will eventually fall somewhere as rain, will it not?
Yes, but not necessarily in that particular area.
I understand, yeah. But yeah. My understanding, and I'm not either a biological systems person or an economist, is that the supply of global water is fixed. It's not fixed by region, by locality, by country. That changes, and so that according to the invitation that went out by, I think, 2024, 2/3 of the globe will be water stressed. But other places might still be having floods.
Yeah. So I think one of the great buffers in this whole thing, I totally agree with the idea that the water management issues will have to be local. And so regional planning and things like that are absolutely paramount, which, you think about our own Mississippi River system and how complex sorting out all those issues are. There are 276 basins that are shared internationally, and more than 60% of them have no comprehensive plans today on basin management. So these are places where some of these conflicts are bound to be present. I think one of the great hopes here, and as an economist, this is our hope, that the laws of comparative advantage kick in. Really, the way we balance water flows globally today is we trade grain. We produce grain in highly productive areas, and we're in the U.S. Corn Belt here. This is an ecological treasure that the world depends on to produce enough grain that we can take off some of the shortages that other places will have. And so trading grain is effectively trading water. And that's one of the ways that we need to think about mitigating risk around water globally is the trade of products where we have comparative advantage to produce and to be quite eco-efficient in that production.
I would concur. Transporting grain is a lot cheaper than transporting water. It's virtually impossible to transport water over very large distances. It's much more feasible to transport grain. So in the end, when you're exporting grain, as you were saying, you're exporting water. And so that, again, it's not necessarily the solution, but it has to be an important part of the solution.
Do you think that either the global population or the American public are yet focused on water? Do they see water as a coming challenge, coming opportunity, coming crisis? Or is water still an ever-present free good? Turn on the faucet and it runs.
I think that depends a lot about where you're at, where you're situated. Certainly it's becoming more of a top-of-mind issue here in our region, and a few years ago it was for completely different reasons around flooding and water management. If you go out west, there are now restrictions on how much water you can apply to your lawn, and there are incentives to actually go away from traditional gardens into rock gardens and so forth like that. My belief is that perceptions on water will be a precursor to what we really need to get real around, which is climate change. And so if we're going to really think about solutions, water will hit us first. The issues around water and our own conditions around water and drought and managing water will be the thing that's standing in front of us, causing us to think deeper about climate change and issues like that.
And it's already hitting us. I think that there's much greater appreciation of issues of water in this part of the world because of the drought this last year and the floods the year before. And I think people recognize that these issues of water are vital to our economy and to our livelihoods. And these changes, these climate extremes are already with us.
Well, I think in a sense you're right, but I still see occasionally the sprinkling systems that my neighbors have on timers sprinkling during the rain.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I wonder what are they thinking?
Yep.
Should we price water differently?
Well, that's a really controversial topic. Again, it's a good question for Dr. Lenton.
I'm happy.
But water in many places is priced. Now you can debate whether it's priced to its appropriate value, and there are very clever strategies popping up all over. And I think the closer you are to the stress, in places like the Middle East and Australia and other places, they've been much more innovative around developing pricing mechanisms where a farmer can actually make the decision: do I keep my water and produce a crop, or do I sell my water and actually it's fungible? It does actually have value. We're not to that stage in many parts of the U.S., but I think that down the road, it's inevitable that we'll find some of that coming to fruition.
And I'm reading now about new subdivisions that have multiple piping systems, one for fresh water and one for recycled water.
Right.
And the purple pipes, I think they're called. You water your lawn with water that's not drinkable. But right now, particularly in the older suburbs of St. Louis with one pipe system, you water your lawn with drinking water, which strikes me as irrational economics.
It's totally irrational. You spend millions of dollars treating the water, and then you use it to water your garden. It just doesn't make sense. But we lived in Delhi in India in the 1980s, and we had a dual system. And so we had treated water, which we still treated more for the household, and we had untreated water for the garden.
And here we have treated water for everything.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
No, I agree. I would love to turn some of the questioning over to the audience, but no one has sent me a written question yet. Do I have some coming? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd be sitting up here thinking we were all wet.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. What role does rainwater harvesting play? I know we harvest crops all the time, but now we're talking about harvesting rainwater.
Well, I think that actually goes right back to the example that I gave. I mean, that's really what farmers that manage soils well are doing, okay? So they're creating a sequestration opportunity, and it's a vast opportunity. I mean, it's nothing that we could develop in any other way. So I think the first order of business is getting soils healthy enough that they can actually provide this service. And in many cases that's being done, but I think fewer than 10% of the cropland area around the world is in this state of what I would call managing the soils to be this buffer that really kind of recruits water. I think there are other low-tech and very appropriate technologies going on. I was in Kenya this summer, and they were building these sand dams, which were basically in these seasonally dry riverbeds, and they'd put in these dams. They were well constructed. They were right down into the riverbed, the rock in the riverbed. And as the seasonal rains would come, they would throw this water down in these events into these dry riverbeds, and the sand would cover it up, and it would keep it from evaporating. And it was basically creating a shallow aquifer in a seasonal dry riverbed. This is a very appropriate technology, and we could be doing more of these things in other places.
Now here's a question on a topic we haven't talked about at all, but certainly has a lot to do with water. Will desalination help the water problem?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to take, is it sufficiently controversial that
Yes,
I can take it?
Yeah, that's kind of a softball, actually, I think.
But it certainly, one has to recognize that desalination costs have really come down in the last several decades. So it's a reality in many parts of the world. We were talking earlier about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has essentially really tapped into its desalination potential. And you find many island states around the world, tourist locations that you've gone to that really use desalination as the principal source of water. That said, it is not a solution, a practical solution, when you're talking about supplying water for areas that are far away from the coast. It just simply, as we were saying earlier, transporting water is enormously costly. So when you're talking about coastal areas, it's certainly very, very feasible. It is already on the map. But as soon as you're talking about transporting it inland, energy costs become huge. And even if you were able to address the water problems with desalination, you'd create a second energy crisis because of the amount of energy that you would require for that.
But the topic raises a question in my mind for you, Michael. Is Monsanto given any thought, or has anyone, any of your competitors even, given thought to salt-tolerant plants? We've talked about drought-resistant. What about salt-tolerant? So you wouldn't have to desalinate the water. You simply sprinkle it on the plants, along with some pepper, maybe.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that's actually been a focus of some research, not necessarily by us, but I think some people in the public sector in particular have been doing some very good work in this area. And I'm not totally up to speed with it, but I think it is a desirable target for investment, and I think it's going to grow in size. I think this is just going to grow in terms of being an issue as a target for investment. So I don't think we're personally doing any work, and I don't know in our competitive set if it's happening, but I think there's some public sector work that has been focusing on this issue.
We've had a lot of snow in the Midwest this year. Will that help ease the pressure of drought effects from last summer? My response would be sure. So
that's right.
Frozen water is water.
I think the only thing to be careful about that is that the amount of, if you got a foot of snow, it translates into much less than a foot of rainfall. And so even if you get a very, very generous snowfall, the actual amount of moisture that results from it is much less than might be apparent. That said, it really is important as a way of building up the moisture in the soil for the growing season.
Here's one that is really intended for you.
Okay.
Growing an entire corn plant to obtain only a handful of nutritious seeds seems very inefficient. Has anyone developed a ratio metric of nutritious yield against water or energy output? What crop plants would rank highest with such a metric? And certainly a corn plant is very big. It may take a lot of water to grow one cob.
That one I'm going to turn over to you, Michael.
Well, touche.
This is a little bit like a tennis match, you know, going back and forth.
It would belie conventional wisdom, but actually corn is extremely water efficient. If we think about this in terms of per unit of output, so per bushel of corn, per bushel of wheat, per ton of tomatoes or something like that, corn actually fares, really well in terms of being water use efficient. So there's a reason that it has been such a successful crop. It's also quite fungible in terms of being able to be used for very different purposes. And so, crops that have these advantages of both, there's what you find when you look into this, if you look under the hood, you actually find that your conventional wisdom is different. So vegetable crops, for example, are actually one of the poorest at converting water to harvestable yield. Now, there's good reasons we should grow vegetables, and I'm not being for vegetables and against corn or vice versa. But if you look deeper, some of these commodity crops like corn, cotton, wheat are actually quite efficient at converting water to something that we can use.
But mentioning corn makes me think of ethanol.
Yeah.
So that when we began, we were talking about more food with less water.
Yeah.
I think of ethanol, and I think of more fuel for less water.
Yeah.
Is that are we going to continue to use corn for fuel as well as for food and feed? Yeah. Or is that a good use of water?
Maybe I can make an observation on that, because I do think that the challenge, as in all these things, has got many dimensions, and I do think we have a challenge not only to produce more food with less water, but we need to find ways to produce energy with less impacts on our water supplies. And if you think about it, almost every form of energy generation, whether it's renewable or non-renewable, has an impact on the water supplies. Just think of virtually any source of energy, and so we need to find ways to be able to reduce the impact on water in our generation of energy. So there are parallel challenges.
In fact, a concept that I just read about the other day that I found interesting, going from carbon footprint to thinking of our water footprint. And our water footprint is pretty heavy because water seems so cheap. Yeah. I was thinking the other day as I stood at the kitchen sink, if there was a meter running, like whenever I pump gas, I see how many gallons and how much money, and it gets very high very fast. If I had that meter on my faucet, I might move more expeditiously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Might not even wash the dishes so often.
That's right. That's right. But you'd get some psychic benefit from that.
And the water footprint is not only the consumption of water, but when you have an impact on it. So if you're changing the quality, if you're polluting the water, if you're heating it, if you're just changing its qualities, that is almost equivalent of consuming it. And so we have to worry about those things.
Here's a question for both of you. What's the single most critical issue facing soybean farmers when it comes to the water crisis?
Well, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about it just that way. I think, soybeans, again, if you just think about, what a soybean needs to be productive around water, again, we've been really successful in the United States at getting conservation tillage to create areas that we can grow soybeans where we haven't been able to grow them before. Okay, and actually, where I'm from in north central Kansas is exactly that. When I was growing up, we were in effectively, many of our farms were in a wheat fallow wheat situation, meaning we'd grow one crop every 2 years, and it was wheat. Now, because of no-till and being able to sequester this soil water, we can grow soybeans quite competitively. One of the issues facing soybean farmers is resistance to a lot of the conventional means of controlling pests. And so I think that is a threat for soybean producers around where they've been able to now kind of expand this area and whether those will be good areas to continue to grow soybeans going forward.
Yep. This is a big one. What kind of policies would you like to see, use unspecified, so it can be either of you, the tortoise or the hare. What kind of policies would you like to see in place to settle water issues between countries?
Again, many different dimensions there, but maybe I could just mention a couple of things. I think the most successful agreements among countries on water use is when there's a concept of trying to be sharing the benefits rather than distributing the water. So the focus is not so much on the water as it's the uses to which the water is put. And there are ways, therefore, of looking at win-win solutions where both countries benefit by using the water more effectively. That's one dimension and one policy aspect. The second is information sharing. In the end, the more that countries share information, are willing to have their data be more publicly available so that countries can recognize the reality of both the supply and the requirements for water. That's really important. And it's not the norm. In many countries, in many situations, countries are very jealous about water. They don't want to share the data.
I like his answer.
Please talk about native species which have deep roots and do not need nearly as much water supplied by people. I think of native species in gardens, in rain gardens, for example, but in agriculture, what's the role of native species in efficiently using water?
You know, I don't think I have a good answer for that question. Again, as an economist, I don't believe I can really weigh in on the benefits of these native species. You know, I think the one thing that I can, and this may be close enough to the question that it may be beneficial, is, you know, more and more I think in agriculture we're thinking about these landscape type solutions where we want multiple things out of these landscapes that are dominated, yes, by agriculture, but provide other services. They provide wildlife habitat services. They provide clean water for cities. And so this integrated planning approach where many of the species that are producing those benefits are in fact native species, and we need to make sure that they're competitive and thriving. And so I think that's a planning strategy around making sure that they have a place in a more integrated agricultural landscape.
We're close to our ending hour, but let me close by asking each one of you a question. If you woke up tomorrow and picked up the paper, what headline about water would you like to see?
Wow. Water problem solved would be a good one. But I think in the end, you know, these issues are going to take lots of small battles that are sort of fought and resolved along the way rather than one big headline. But if you are pressing me on a headline and a local one, I would say, you know, policies to price water. Maybe you're talking about a local decision that might have an impact locally. That's what I would say.
Because I can anticipate a headline saying drought is broken, but then we go back to our usual ways of using water. We fall back into our habits until the next drought.
Yeah, you know, I think so. 2013, I think, has been deemed the International Year of Cooperation in water, and I think You know, one of the themes, in fact, the theme that I think was submitted and was chosen as kind of the theme for this year was water, water everywhere as long as we share. And I think there is a reason for that. I go back to that example I talked about. It's just 1 inch. Just 1 inch of water sequestered in soil is 8 trillion gallons of water. There's plenty of water. But we have to get real about putting some of these solutions in place. And so I think this concept of creating water out of our innovation, out of the soils, creating these soils that can sequester water, creating these cooperative agreements where we do have enough water, and recognizing that if we're smart about this, we have these solutions. You know, I think that really when you look at the ways that we can optimize water use globally, there's certainly less than 10% of the agricultural landscapes that are utilizing the full complement of those solutions. Just think if we go to 20% or 30% or 50%. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I'm not doom and gloom on this issue. I'm very optimistic that we'll wrestle this issue to the ground as long as we kind of go with this theme, which I think is an excellent theme for the year.
Thank you both very much. Before Jim Carrington starts his remarks, I would like to take my glass of water and toast both my guests.
Cheers.
Very good.
Cheers.
And Jim, thank you for distracting people for just that moment, because I had to lower the podium about 4 inches from Jay. Thanks. Well, wow, what a great crowd and what a great conversation. This was terrific, it's timely, and there's no issue here at the Danforth Center that's more important than water. This is something we talk about every day, and many of our labs are working on this problem, from the genetics to other aspects. And in fact, we hope to be hiring a number of people in the near future that will add to the critical mass in this area, particularly those areas relating to crops that are underground. And for those of you who have stopped to think about roots, you're actually one of the first people to think about them, because scientists have really underappreciated the contribution of roots, what makes a root system, how roots work. We actually know relatively little about how that works, but that's really where all the action is in terms of much of the water use efficiency that is being bred into modern day crops. We had a lot of questions submitted by the audience, and we couldn't get to most of them. However, this is only part one of a two-part series on water that we're doing in the conversation series. Part two is on May 23rd, right here. It's going to feature Tom Britnell from the Danforth Center, our director of the Enterprise Institute for Renewable Fuels, who's going to be talking about research here at the Danforth Center and elsewhere on the basis of water use efficiency in plants. We'll also have another guest that will be named later, but please mark March 23rd on your calendar. And in fact, we're going to save some of the questions. I'm sorry, May 23rd, thank you, on your calendar. We're going to save some of the questions that we didn't have a chance to get to for that session. Thank you, Roberto, for coming all the way from Nebraska. Thank you, Michael, for walking across the street. This was terrific. As always, Jim, thank you for moderating this excellent session. Thank you, the audience, for coming. Again, this is a terrific turnout, and that's a reflection of the importance of this topic and our guests. I want to close by thanking Matt Wolf, who's not here, for doing a great job with the Friends Committee, and thanking Jay Noose, our new chair of the Friends Committee, for taking over this job that's very important for us here at the Danforth Center. I also want to thank Molly Klein, who is the driver for putting together this series on water. So thank you all for coming, and let's thank the panel again.